Amid the constant noise of our minds, there lies an ancient wisdom that teaches us how to find peace amidst the chaos of our thoughts. This is the story of a journey that begins with a hesitant step and ends with a profound understanding of the nature of our own mind. A story about learning to live peacefully with our thoughts, even when they feel like an endless storm. The sun had yet to rise when the young merchant began his ascent up the temple stairs on the mountain. His feet were tired, but his mind was even more exhausted. For 3 days and 3 nights, he had traveled without proper rest, tormented by thoughts swirling like leaves in an endless whirlwind. His clothes, once elegant, were now wrinkled and dirty from the long journey, reflecting the state of his mind disheveled and confused. With each step he climbed, his mind bombarded him with doubts. What if this temple isn't the right place? What if I'm wasting my time? Perhaps I should have stayed to manage my business. These were the same thoughts that had haunted him for months, waking him in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, replaying old conversations and imagining future scenarios that never came to pass. The merchant carried not only his travel bag, but also the weight of 1,000 worries. Worries about deals that could go wrong, about words left unsaid in past relationships, about decisions made years ago that still haunted him like restless ghosts. His mind was like a theater in constant operation, staging endless plays of what if and what if not. Reaching the top of the staircase, he stopped before the large red gate of the temple. It was a simple gate, yet to him, it seemed to hold all the mysteries of the universe. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. Should I knock 3 times? Or would it be more respectful to knock just once? What if I look foolish? What will they think of a successful merchant seeking help like a beggar? Then, he noticed something curious. The gate was slightly ajar. A small opening, no wider than his hand, seemed to invite him inside. But even this simple decision became a storm in his mind. Should I enter? Would it be rude to go in uninvited? Perhaps I should wait here. But for how long? What if no one comes? The wind blew gently, moving the leaves scattered on the temple grounds. The merchant watched as they danced aimlessly, much like his own thoughts, some swirling high, others crawling low, all without a clear destination. He realized he had stood there so long that his legs began to ache, simply watching the leaves and getting lost in thoughts about his thoughts. In the temple garden, a small bell swayed in the breeze, producing a sound so soft it felt like a whisper. The merchant found himself pondering the meaning of that sound, trying to interpret whether it was a sign to enter or to leave. His palms grew sweaty, his heart raced. The simplicity of crossing a gate had transformed into an insurmountable problem. At that moment, a dry leaf floated past his feet and slipped through the gap in the gate, carried by the same breeze that made the bell ring. The merchant watched it glide effortlessly into the temple, without hesitation, without questioning, without the endless analysis he applied to every small movement in his life. He remained there, frozen between the desire to follow the leaf and the fear of the unknown, between the hope of finding peace and the familiar comfort of his restless thoughts. His mind continued its incessant monologue, but something had shifted. For the first time, he could see his thoughts for what they truly were. Just thoughts, as light and fleeting as leaves in the wind. The merchant finally stepped through the gate, his footsteps echoing in the empty courtyard of the temple. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the morning light cast long shadows across the stone ground. That's when he noticed a serene figure sweeping leaves in a distant corner of the courtyard. It was an elderly monk, dressed in a simple saffron robe, sweeping the same spot repeatedly, even though there were no more leaves left to sweep. For a long time, the merchant simply observed. His mind, as usual, began to weave stories. Why is he sweeping where it's already clean? Has he not seen me? Should I approach him? Perhaps he's too busy. Is he testing me? The thoughts multiplied like ripples on a pond, each one spawning 10 others, until his head felt ready to burst from the possibilities and interpretations. The monk continued sweeping, seemingly unaware of the visitor's presence. His movements were fluid, almost like a gentle dance. He swept to the right, then to the left, always at the same rhythm, always in the same spot. The sound of the broom against the ground created a hypnotic melody. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher into the sky. The merchant remained rooted in place, torn between the urge to speak and the fear of interrupting. His feet ached, his throat was dry, yet something held him there, captivated by this seemingly meaningless scene. With every sweep of the broom, his own thoughts seemed to churn more furiously. Perhaps I should leave, he thought for the 100th time. Clearly, he doesn't want to be disturbed. Or is he trying to teach me something? But what could anyone learn from sweeping the same clean spot? Am I wasting my time? Am I missing an opportunity? Why can't I simply make a decision? Then, he noticed something curious. The longer he watched the monk sweeping, the more aware he became of his own repetitive thoughts. Just like the broom passing over the same spot, his mind was trapped in an endless cycle of unanswered questions, sweeping and re-sweeping the same worries. By the time the sun was nearly at its peak, the merchant finally found his voice. "Venerable One," he called out, his voice trembling more than he would have liked. "Why do you keep sweeping where it's already clean?" For the first time, the monk paused. Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet the merchant's. His face was serene, marked by age, yet his eyes sparkled with an unexpected vitality. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they simply looked at one another. Then, in a voice as soft as the morning breeze, the monk replied, "Why think about what has already been thought?" The simplicity of the response struck the merchant like a bolt of lightning. All the hours he had spent watching the monk sweep the same clean spot were a mirror of his own mind, repeating the same thoughts, revisiting the same worries, sweeping and re-sweeping memories and fears that had already been examined beyond measure. The monk resumed sweeping, now with a slight smile on his lips. The sound of the broom continued, sh 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 sh. But for the merchant, the sound had changed. It was no longer irritating or confusing. It was as if each sweep of the broom was clearing not just the ground, but also his restless mind. The merchant remained there, absorbing the significance of the moment, as the monk leaned his broom against the temple wall and made a gentle gesture for him to follow. They walked in silence along a narrow path that wound behind the main temple until they reached a garden unlike anything the merchant had ever seen. It was not a grand or spectacular garden. In fact, his first impression was one of disarray. Some areas were overrun with weeds, others had wilting plants, and there were patches that seemed completely abandoned. In contrast, certain flower beds showcased blooms so meticulously cared for that they seemed almost unreal. The monk stopped before a particularly chaotic section of the garden. It was a small square of earth, no larger than a tatami mat, where plants of all kinds grew without order or care. Some were choking others, some were dying for lack of sunlight, while others grew wildly, without direction. "This is your garden now," the monk said, his voice calm and steady like still water. The merchant's heart raced. His thoughts began to swirl immediately. "What do you mean, my garden? I know nothing about gardening. What if I kill all the plants? How long will I have to stay here? What should I do first? Is this some kind of test?" As if reading his thoughts, the monk crouched down and scooped up a handful of soil. He let the earth slowly fall through his fingers as he spoke. "Each plant here is like one of your thoughts. Some need pruning. Others need more space to grow. Some are useful, others not so much, but all are part of the garden." Then, the monk handed the merchant 3 simple tools: pruning shears, a watering can, and a small spade. "Care for this garden as you would care for your mind. Do not rip anything out with force. Do not try to make anything grow too quickly. Simply observe, tend, and allow. The merchant looked at the tools in his hands, then at the chaotic garden before him. But how will I know what to do? How can I tell what should stay and what should go? What if I make a mistake? The monk smiled softly. You will know. Just as with your thoughts, each plant will tell you what it needs. Some will shout for attention, others will whisper. Your task is only to listen. In the days that followed, the merchant spent hours tending to his small garden. At first, his hands trembled each time he had to make a decision. Should he cut this weed or leave it? Water this flower more or less? Every choice seemed laden with infinite consequences. But gradually, something began to change. The more time he spent with the plants, the less he thought and the more he felt. He began to notice how some flowers turned toward the sun, while others thrived in the shade. He learned that some plants needed pruning to grow stronger, while others simply needed space and time. One day, as he carefully pruned a shrub, he realized he hadn't thought about his problems for hours. His hands had found a natural rhythm. His movements flowed without the constant weight of overanalysis. The garden wasn't perfect. There were still weeds, and some plants still struggled to survive, but there was a budding harmony in his little patch of earth. It was then that he noticed something even more profound. Just as he had learned not to fight the nature of the plants, he was beginning to accept the nature of his own thoughts. Some required attention, others could be gently trimmed back, and some simply needed space to exist. The monk, who occasionally stopped by to observe his work, paused that afternoon. He gazed at the garden for a long moment before saying, "Do you see how the garden teaches? Each plant has its time, its space, its nature. We cannot force a bud to bloom before it's ready, just as we cannot force the mind to become still. We can only create the right conditions and wait patiently." The merchant had grown accustomed to the garden's routine when the weather began to change. The air grew heavier, and dark clouds started gathering on the horizon. It was the beginning of the rainy season, and with it came an anxiety he hadn't felt in weeks. As the first thunder echoed through the mountains, his old patterns of thought returned like a flood. What if the rain destroys everything I've planted? What if it's too strong? Or too little? Should I cover the plants? Leave them exposed? Why didn't I think of this before? His hands began to tremble again, and his heart raced with each new flash of lightning that lit up the sky. When the first drops began to fall, the merchant rushed to his garden with pieces of bamboo and large leaves he had hastily gathered. His hands moved frantically, trying to build makeshift shelters to protect each delicate plant. Sweat mixed with the rain on his face as he fought against the storm and his own fears. Then, he noticed the monk standing under the temple's veranda, watching the rain with the same calmness with which he observed everything. The merchant hesitated for a moment, his hands full of bamboo, his body drenched from the rain now falling harder. "Come," the monk called, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the storm's noise. Reluctantly, the merchant abandoned his materials and ran to the veranda. His body was cold and wet, but his mind was boiling with worries. They stood there in silence, watching the rain pour over the garden. The heavy drops struck the leaves and flowers with a force that seemed brutal to the merchant. "Watch how the plants move with the rain," the monk finally said. "They don't resist, they don't fight. They bend when they must and straighten when they can." The merchant looked more closely. It was true. The more flexible plants swayed with the wind and rain, bending almost to the ground only to rise again. The flowers closed their petals, protecting themselves naturally. Even the most delicate plants had their own way of handling the storm. "But some might die," the merchant protested, his hands gripping the veranda's railing. "Yes," the monk replied. "Some might die. Others will grow stronger. Some seeds only germinate after a heavy rain. The storm is neither good nor bad. It simply is. A particularly bright flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The merchant flinched instinctively, but noticed that the plants simply continued their dance with the wind and water. Your thoughts are like this rain, the monk continued. They may seem overwhelming, as if they'll destroy everything you've built. But just like these plants, you can learn to dance with them instead of fighting against them. Hours passed as they remained on the veranda, watching the storm. Gradually, the merchant began to see beauty where he had only seen danger before. The way the water created small rivers between the flower beds, how the drops sparkled on the leaves when an occasional ray of sunlight pierced the clouds, how each plant adapted in its own way. When the storm finally passed, the garden looked different. Some flowers had lost their petals, and a few seedlings lay flattened in the mud. But there was also a freshness in the air, a new vitality in every leaf that had survived. And there, emerging from the freshly soaked soil, the merchant saw something he hadn't noticed before. Tiny green sprouts, seeds that the storm itself had awakened. "See?" the monk said softly. "The storm has passed as all storms do. Your garden survived, not because you protected it, but because you allowed it to face the rain in its own way. Your thoughts are the same. They come like a storm, but if you don't fight them, if you let them pass naturally, you'll find that even the most difficult situations can bring growth." The next morning, after the storm had passed, before the sun had fully risen, the monk came to fetch the merchant. The air was still damp and fresh, and a gentle mist hovered over the temple grounds. Without saying a word, the monk led him along a path he had never taken before, winding behind the main garden. After a short walk, they arrived at a small natural lake, fed by a mountain spring. The surface of the water was so still it resembled a perfect mirror, reflecting the morning sky in hues of pink and blue. The mist danced lightly across the surface, forming ethereal shapes that appeared and vanished like fleeting thoughts. "Sit here," the monk said, motioning to a smooth stone at the edge of the lake. The merchant complied, feeling the cold of the stone seep through his clothes. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird and the soft dripping of water from the spring. "Look at your reflection," the monk instructed. The merchant leaned over the water. In the soft morning light, his reflection was perfectly clear. He could see every detail of his face, each line of expression, each strand of hair. He noticed how his eyes seemed different, now less restless, clearer, though they still carried traces of worry. "What do you see?" asked the monk. "I see my reflection," the merchant replied. "I see my face, my eyes, my—" Before he could finish, the monk picked up a small stone and tossed it into the lake. The impact created concentric ripples that completely distorted the reflection. The merchant's face morphed into a dance of unrecognizable fragmented shapes, scattered by the movement of the water. "And now, what do you see?" "I can't see anything clearly," the merchant said. "The ripples have distorted everything." The monk smiled gently. "Keep looking." The merchant watched the ripples move across the surface. Gradually, they began to subside. The distortion softened, becoming less chaotic. Slowly, his reflection began to reappear first in fragments, then more clearly, until finally, the lake's surface returned to its stillness, and his reflection was as sharp as it had been before. "Your mind is like this lake," the monk said. "In its natural state, it is clear and still, perfectly reflecting reality. Your thoughts are like the stones we throw into the water. They create disturbances, ripples that distort your perception of reality." The merchant continued to observe his reflection, noticing how even the slightest breeze created small ripples on the surface, subtly altering the image. "But notice something important," the monk continued. "No matter how many stones we throw, no matter how many ripples form, the fundamental nature of the lake does not change. The water always returns to its natural stillness. The ripples cannot last forever. They arise and fade on their own. To demonstrate, the monk picked up another stone, this time larger, and tossed it in. The ripples were bigger, more intense, and distorted the reflection completely. Yet again, with time, the water settled, returning to its calm, clear state. Do you see how we don't need to do anything to make the water calm? We don't need to fight the ripples or force the lake to be still. Its nature is to return to stillness on its own. The merchant realized he had been holding his breath while watching the water calm. He exhaled slowly, feeling a deeper understanding form within him. Your troubling thoughts are like these ripples, the monk said. They may seem intense. They may completely distort your view of reality. But if you observe patiently, you'll see that they too pass naturally. The fundamental nature of your mind, like that of the lake, is clear and tranquil. You don't need to fight your thoughts. Just watch them rise and fall like waves on the water. The seasons had changed 3 times since the merchant arrived at the temple. His garden had become something different from what he had initially imagined. It wasn't the most beautiful in the temple, nor the most organized, but it had a harmony of its own. Some plants grew strong, others remained delicate, and there were empty spaces he had learned to accept as part of the whole. On a particularly clear morning, while he was watering the plants, the monk approached with a serene smile. "It is time," he said simply. The merchant felt his heart tighten. The thoughts, now gentler than before, still arose. Time for what? Already? But there's still so much to learn. Yet, unlike before, he didn't get lost in them. He watched them pass, like clouds in the sky. But what about the garden? He asked, looking at the space he had cared for so lovingly. The monk sat on the stone bench near the garden and gestured for the merchant to join him. "Tell me, what has this garden taught you?" The merchant remained silent for a moment, observing how the morning light played between the leaves. "I've learned that some things need pruning, others need space to grow. That I can't control the rain or the sun, but I can learn to work with them. That sometimes what seems like a devastating storm brings new seeds. And what about your thoughts? I've learned that they're like the plants. Some are useful, others not so much, but all are part of the garden of my mind. I don't need to uproot them violently or try to force them to be different. I can simply observe them, tend to them when needed, and let them pass when it's time." The monk smiled. "Then the garden has taught you well. Now it is time to take these lessons back into the world. But what if my thoughts return to how they were before? What if I forget everything I've learned?" "Look at this flower," said the monk, pointing to a small purple bloom growing in the corner of the garden. "It opens its petals in the morning and closes them at night. It doesn't struggle against this cycle, nor does it worry about whether it will open again tomorrow. It simply follows its nature." The merchant watched the flower sway gently in the breeze. "Just like thoughts come and go?" "Exactly. True peace doesn't lie in the absence of thoughts, just as a garden isn't made only of perfect flowers. Peace lies in understanding that, just as this garden will continue its natural cycle even without your constant care, your mind has the natural wisdom to find its own balance." That afternoon, the merchant packed his few belongings. Before leaving, he returned one last time to his small garden. He looked at each plant, each space, each little corner he had tended with such care. He realized that the garden had never been about creating something perfect. It was about learning to accept imperfection, change, and the natural flow of things. And so, with a lighter heart and a clearer mind, the merchant left the temple. His thoughts were still there, but now he saw them differently. They were no longer enemies to be fought or problems to be solved. They were simply part of his inner garden, as natural as the flowers that open in the morning and close at night. The true lesson of the temple wasn't about how to stop thinking, but about how to live in peace with his thoughts. Just as a garden needs both sunshine and rain to flourish, our minds need all kinds of thoughts, joyful and sad, clear and confused. Wisdom lies in not clinging to any of them, allowing them to come and go naturally, like the changing seasons. In the end, our mind is like a constantly changing garden. It doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful, nor controlled to be wise. It only needs to be accepted and understood in its deepest nature, where true peace resides, not in the absence of thoughts, but in the wisdom to let them flow.